but actually, of course, you're all here for a completely different reason, which is to listen to Gareth, who you know is a wonderful speaker on an enormous number of subjects, and always has something which most of us don't know about at all. So Gareth, could I ask you just to lead on, and we'll also turn our machines off and let you have the floor. But thank you very much indeed, yet again, for coming to entertain us. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks for the very kind words. That I say, I hope I can bring something new tonight again. I'll just start off by sharing screen. So I'll just make sure with somebody that they can actually see the screen perfectly well. So John, can you just confirm to me you've got this screen?
Gareth, we've got your marching, fighting, dying, contemporary. We've got the full screen, yes. Absolutely fantastic. Then at least I can move on. Okay, great. Well, as you know, I've been doing a lot of work for a number of years on Waterloo, particularly with regard to finding new sources, etc. And I wanted to come back to the Peninsula, where it's probably a little bit more difficult to find anything astoundingly new. It's a little less sort of, should we say, the history is not as questionable as some of the Waterloo stuff. I'll leave it at that point. So I decided to look at it in a slightly different way, and I'll explain why in a minute now. But I guess I've called this the marching, fighting, dying, because that's probably what, if you ask what most soldiers thought of what they were doing in Spain, that's probably just as much as they said. But let me just start on about this. Let's move on if we can. Why is it not moving on? Here we go. Okay, now I'm walking into an area that has been dealt with over the years quite a lot, and therefore, you know, whether it's Oman years ago, Ed Koss with his excellent work in other areas, etc. And then obviously recently Gavin Daly has brought out a book as well on the subject. But there's one thing I've been noticing when I've been looking at all of these different works, is that there is a profusion of using these type of books. And you'll say, what's wrong with all these? You know, Costello, William Brown, and sort of Sergeant William Lawrence, etc., Kincaid of the Rifles. They're obviously excellent accounts of the period, but they were obviously all written quite a long time after the wars. And that has some effect on what they say and how they say it, and differs in some ways to what you actually get from the contemporary stuff. And that's why I wanted to go back to that side of things. Another thing you have to be aware is in the Victorian period, a number of people started writing novels, but making them look like the real thing. And you've got these, for example, Ned Clinton, which was actually written by Captain Francis Glass, who had been in the 95th, but was actually in the 25th foot when he wrote it on half pay. Charles Lever, an Irish novelist, wrote Charles O'Malley, the Irish Dragoon. But I also even see in history books, Charles O'Neill of the 28th foot being mentioned quite often in history books. And yet there's a very big doubt as to whether Charles O'Neill even existed, because he certainly doesn't exist in the muster lists of the 28th foot at any time that I can find in the Peninsula or Waterloo, which he claimed to be both in. So you have to be very careful of the sources you use. Now, one of the problems we have with this is that, you know, obviously these post-war memoirs, well, look at why they actually appeared, first of all. Lots of half-pay officers and soldiers or on very small pensions suddenly found that Victorians just wanted to hear all about what had happened in the Great War, as everyone knew it as at that time. And there was a great drive
to get the people to sort of publish these memoirs. And for those writing these memoirs, there was a financial incentive by far. Now, obviously very few books sort of appeared during the wars themselves. There's a few little letter books, etc. Most of these are way after that. And these explosion of memoirs caused those that followed to have to be even more, what can I say? They had to make them even more exciting. So they described the battle scenes in much more greater detail, and the hardships as much harder perhaps than other people had previously or whatever. So there's this constant drive to make it even more exciting, and they borrow each other's stories as well. So you get that going on as well, where, you know, somebody you'll come across a story and you think, hang on, I've read that before in a previous memoir, and it's been claimed by other people as well. So you get all of that sort of thing. You also, as you would get with Waterloo, with people getting affected by the fact that they started reading Cyborn. Well, of course, after 1828, you've got people being influenced by Napier. And of course, they're then either taking large sections of his book and just publishing them as part of their book, or they're using what he says happened as part of their account, and they expand their account by doing that. Again, this is changing what they actually knew at the time. The other one I want to bring up, which I'll only mention in brief detail here, but in fact, I'll bring it up further on later on, is the fact that moral attitudes, like everything else, changes with time. And Victorian attitudes to certain things were very different for the attitudes that were around at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And you will see that there are areas where the accounts from this that you read of these later accounts, they actually do pick up on these new moral attitudes, and it may be they've genuinely changed their own attitudes over that period themselves, but they certainly reflect the more modern thinking. And my basic point, therefore, is that when you are trying to understand exactly what the soldiers and officers did and thought during the Peninsular War, be very wary of books that actually start with the title adventures or memoirs or the jottings or the retrospects or the sketches of anything like that, because at the end of the day, they are definitely tainting our view of the history of the period and probably even distorting some of our views. Now, the first thing I want to bring up is literacy rates, because it generally seems to be accepted that, well, virtually every soldier that went to the army, you know, basic soldier, apart from the officers, couldn't write. Well, actually, that's not true. Between 1750 and early 1800s, it's stated that about 50 to 55% of the population, the adult population, could read and write. And that actually panned out at about 60% male and about 30% female at the start of the period, rising to about 40% at the end of the period. And then that continued to rise, and it definitely continued to rise in the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars into the Waterloo period, because you can definitely see a huge increase in the number of letters and journals that are being written. And by the 1880s, both sexes had equalized at about 80% of the being literate. So literacy was not as big a problem as actually people sometimes assume. And as I say, that means that when we look at it, it explains why there are more letters and journals around than we think. Because obviously officers had to read and write, but also anybody who was an NCO, because of course they had to complete reports, etc., and therefore you had to be able to do so. And one interesting figure I find is that only 5% of recruits actually fail to sign their own name. So therefore, it indicates that, you know, there was a reasonably high level of literacy even within the army, even though that seemed to have been perhaps by some people that it was only the dregs of society that went into the army. And as the war went on, that literacy level definitely increased. Now, I'm not saying that it's a given that the weavers, etc., hand weavers, etc., were forced into the army as the sort of their levels of income dropped dramatically, as you can see on the screen there, during the period, and were forced to actually look for new work. And many joined the army. It's not given that they were all more literate, should we say, but there's certainly an increase in literacy in that period. And I do think that a number of these people were, and it's quite surprising how many of the memoirs we have are from people that were in the weaving profession. And the other one that is a bit of a hobby horse with me, it's something I'm still working on to prove exactly, but there is definitely a rise of nonconformism in both society and in the army at this period. And it is certain, to my mind, that the numbers of ordinary rankers who can actually read, because they are required as a nonconformist to actually be able to read the Bible themselves, to study it, that in fact the numbers of able to do so, read and write, definitely increases during the period. And certainly you can say that with other ranks, because it is quite difficult, as I found myself, although I have found a number of letters and sort of small journals, etc., written by soldiers earlier in the Peninsular War. You can see as the Peninsular War goes on, a few more appear. And as we get into Waterloo, you actually get an awful lot more again. So there is definitely, I think, nonconformism is having an effect on that. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is that this is really the first major war that I believe where the ready availability of post to all ranks at all times throughout the Peninsular War is actually a major benefit to us regarding the number of people that write home, etc., and these letters being preserved. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about the post office packet service, but the packet service for all ships sailing west from the UK was actually based in Falmouth. It was set there because if you can actually see on the smaller of the two little maps there, you can see that it's the Cornwall area points out beyond the main areas in France, which cause it a problem for ships to sail and get out of the channel, should we say, against winds coming from the west, etc. The only reason that ships, the only time that the ships had a problem coming out of Falmouth was southeasterly winds, which actually is quite rare for us in Britain. So in fact, westerly winds was not a problem. Once they were out, they could actually beat their way to the south relatively easily and get round the corner of France and across Bay of Biscay, etc. Hence why most of the actual mail for going west left from there. And as part of that, this is a nice picture of a few of the actual packet ships leaving on a regular basis. They were relatively lightly armed, but they did carry cannon, etc., to actually defend themselves. But their main aim was to actually outsail any attacker, basically. And they were actually therefore built to be extremely fast. But one of the things that is important to this period for us is what I've written at the bottom there, is there was a weekly service from Falmouth that went via La Coruna, which was actually not, the packet owners were not particularly happy with, because there was not actually that much mail to go there, before it went down to Lisbon on every week. Now, it's not saying it arrived there every week, we'll talk about it in a minute, but it certainly set off every week. And you may be interested to know how quickly they got the mail, etc. Well, if the mail left London on a Tuesday, the packet could sail on the Friday. And if it was on the Wednesday was the other day, they would sail on the Saturday. So it was taking them about 3 days to get it from London to Falmouth to actually sail. Now, the first thing I try to instill to people is about, in an age now where letter writing is becoming a lost art. Many of you on this call might actually be ex-services, and for those who are in the British services, I'm sure you know what a bluey is, which is actually the little very light blue sort of light paper, sort of, which folded in on itself letter that you could actually sort of send for virtually nothing, in free to most of the time, to your loved ones in the services. And certainly when I was in the Navy, I hung on every delivery. Hopefully there was a few in there for me, and I was very upset if they weren't. And in fact, this is a period when exactly that starts, because you literally see letters coming through constantly
saying, I've had some letters off you, thank goodness, whatever, or I've had nothing you from months, you're a terrible correspondent, why don't you get in touch, etc. So I feel almost a synergy with them in that sense, because I know exactly how I felt in the 1980s when I was in the Navy. But as you can see by some of the comments I just tagged alongside, and these are just a couple of random ones I've just picked out from the situation. But obviously they were still under sail. It was therefore very stuck and sort of to the winds, etc. So the amount of time they would get there. But it could be a 5-day passage, 4 to 5 days, and they can have the mails in Lisbon. On a bad time, and in fact, the last one on here is the worst I could find anywhere, it was 57 days. And by that stage, they had something like 6 packets that hadn't arrived, because the weekly packets were all out there trying to get across the Bay of Biscay, but having real troubles, obviously, in the bad weather and obviously contrary winds. But as I said, it's all part of this picking up the picture. Now, obviously, they were also writing home an awful lot. And there's obviously a reason why these are really important to me, as far as I'm concerned, and to historians, is the fact that the first is that obviously that there's absolutely no hindsight involved. And as I said, before Napier and everybody else. They talk exactly about what they really believe. It's a private letter, usually to a private family member or a damn good friend. And they would actually criticize, they would moan, they would actually say it exactly as they thought it was. And, were not afraid to criticize either fellow officers, senior officers, their own troops, anybody, and describe the worst scenes possible or anything. So, they are very valuable in that sense. Some of the later stuff is censored, should we say. No publisher wants to be taken to court for publishing something and for libel, etc. So there's an awful lot of that going on. So in these letters, you get all of the honest, forthright comments. Obviously, they talk a huge amount about career prospects, how they're doing in the army, obviously how the family's doing at home, all that sort of stuff. It just, every conceivable subject you can think of, money problems, which we'll talk about in a minute, because obviously they were always short of money out there, but also getting luxuries from home, asking for things that they couldn't get in Spain and Portugal, etc. And the biggest one of all, I guess, is that there was no censorship of the mail. The only thing that I've ever come across is there are some hints that at times Wellington just made sure that the sack of mail didn't catch that packet, so that his official information got through to London before letters did. So there is some hint that Wellington used that ploy to ensure that his words got there first, should we say. But that's the only censorship there was. And certainly a number of people actually wrote to say that they'd please be aware that, what I'm sending you home in all this honesty of what's going on, etc. Please do not put in the newspapers, etc. Because that happened to a couple of people and they got into extremely serious problems, obviously, regarding it. There was also a huge exchange of goods, actually. As you would imagine, there was a huge demand for new uniform to be sent out. So, the saddles and boots or new uniform or whatever. But there was actually a huge demand for stuff to go the other way as well. And the packets were doing a great trade in sending stuff back. Where there was sheet music, there seems to be a very regular request for Spanish guitars. Unsurprisingly, both wine and port in huge quantities. I mean, we're talking about vats carrying 150 and 200 gallons, etc. And even live merino sheep to start new sort of flocks in the UK. So if anybody's got some merinos from that period, still a flock still going anywhere, please let me know, because I've been really interested to know about that. And obviously, original journals from the period are also very important, as long as they haven't been rewritten later, which unfortunately many of the ones I've talked about earlier have been. Now, I'm just going to leave this up as before I go into some detail about life in Spain, etc.
If you've got a minute to just try and read a bit of this at least, but it's a really nice letter from an officer in Spain who actually is writing about his 4 children, to one of his children, Charles, his oldest kid, which he calls Car. And he actually goes on about obviously bringing him a pony, etc., except the fact he'd be a bit too frisky, etc., and a little donkey, as he calls it, for the little Lou, the girl. And for the newest one, Lou, they'll get some sort of barley sugars, etc. I'm going to leave it to the end of this. I'm just going to say, I've left a question mark there on purpose because it's a lovely little sort of letter to a son who was only about 5 at the time. And if anybody wants to put up a suggestion in the box at the end of the day to who this actual officer was, quite a very well-known officer, but perhaps not the type of letter you'd expect from him. I'll leave it at that. Okay, so they're off to the Peninsula. I have to say this is probably the most romantic version of Off to the Peninsula I think that exists in the world, but I thought I'd use it. Clearly, obviously, most of the women would be distraught as the fact that only 6 per 100 men could actually leave, etc. And they were off to a new world, a brave new world, should we say, and somewhere they had no idea about at all. And it's more about that I want to talk about. Now, the first thing I want to say is that most of the memoirs you come across will actually go on about the rotting, unseaworthy transports with a drunken crew, basically, and captain, often having to sort of escape enemy warships and privateers, etc. Perhaps it's not, I mean, that's absolutely true of the first couple of years of the war, but in fact, it's not particularly understood by many people. Around about 1811, they actually stopped using transport ships because it was obvious that they were so vulnerable and it was quite awkward to actually convoy them, etc. So in fact, the decision was actually made to send virtually all troops in Royal Navy vessels. And you'll actually find from that date, if you look at most of the sort of contemporary stuff, I'm on HMS such and such. And most of the discussion is talking about the sort of the Royal Navy way of operating ships, etc. And there is some hints, in fact, that the men had to follow the watch system like the rest of the sailors, possibly because there wasn't enough bunks for them all to actually sort of stay in all night. And you have the soldiers having to congregate on the sort of deck for the 4-hour watch or whatever, in whatever horrible weather there is. And I think it's largely because it appears that there's actually no room for them downstairs. So that, you know, they're obviously having to hot bunk it just like the sailors. But let's get to Lisbon. Now, we all know, and I'm sure you've read enough of these things for me not to say anything new about this, about the fact that they arrive at Black Horse Square, which is what you can see in the distance there at the front there, as they called it. And they would come in and see this beautiful city from the waterline, from the water's edge, should we say, and they sort of think it was going to be absolutely beautiful on land. But they would then actually arrive in Lisbon, and they would make comments like they are on this page. And this is just a couple of random ones I've done here again, such as, you know, as soon as you get on foot onto land, the stench, the filth, and everything that's thrown in the streets. And I've given you 3 different sort of comments here, which are very similar, explaining about the sort of the way that everything got chucked into the street and how you had to be so careful at night, because it was at night time they emptied the chamber pots out into the streets, etc. So you had to be very careful where you were walking, etc. The only thing I will say to you is these are not all about Lisbon. In fact, only one is. The first one's about Lisbon. The second one is about Castelo Branco. And the third one is about Corunna. So it's not just Lisbon on their arrival that they're actually thinking, what have I walked into? And as you probably noticed, I've used a few of these sort of Johnny Newcomb sort of pictures. And this is just another excellent one of him arriving in Lisbon, in this case. And Rawlinson has obviously picked on all of the things. He obviously had somebody advising him on what to put in the pictures, etc. But, you know, the beggars on the streets of Lisbon, etc., is all part of that. And as I say, you know, the general things they mentioned were the general filth on the streets with everything being thrown out at night. the terrible poverty and obviously the number of beggars in the country, not really understanding what had been going on in the peninsula and how many people had actually been driven from their homes, etc. The dilapidated houses and the fact that the city wasn't completely reconstructed after the earthquake. Obviously an incomprehensible language, which to most English people has always been. It's like, you know, why can't you speak English? The idleness and the siestas, etc., was obviously something they didn't understand, but certainly the smells, garlic and sardines, etc., in food. Well, the smell, as far as they were concerned, was appalling. I mean, they're not smells they'd ever come across in their life. And the exceptionally oily foods, all the things now that we would think nothing of, but clearly to them, it was a complete anathema. Obviously extremely noisy, very crowded into what, I mean, Lisbon effectively was almost like, they were almost like the Scottish tenements with large numbers of floors and each family on each floor, etc. Obviously, packs of wild dogs roaming the streets. The French had tried to get rid of most of them, but they hadn't. There's still lots of them around. Obviously, the huge number of priests and monks. There's lots of comments about the sort of attitudes to the Catholic religion, etc., which is obviously completely different to what they knew at home. And the fact that they had very few home comforts. So, as you can see, they had much to moan about. But I guess actually, one of the things that comes out quite clearly is that this is all a huge culture shock to them as they come off the ships. And unsurprisingly, all this is appalling and they can't stand it. But what is interesting is that once they've been in the country a couple of years, it's quite surprising how many of them start talking about, this is a great place to actually retire to. A gentleman can retire here and live on a very good wage, you know, his half pension or whatever, very well here, etc. And there's even comments as they go into France that I'm going to miss Spain and Portugal. So my comment is, to some extent, is that yes, you know, and you get a lot of this in these older, these memoirs that later on after the war. But just remember that those who were there did start changing their attitudes. Not everybody, some people left it hating the place still, but there was the great majority came to love the place, which is perhaps not an image you get. Now, obviously, the first thing we'll talk about is officers leaving. We'll talk to the officers first, but leaving Lisbon to start with, or Corunna, whatever it is, to start on the march to the army. And of course, the first thing they had to do was to actually buy a pony and their horse, etc. They needed a sort of mule at least, and to carry the baggage. And I've just attached one here of a canteen that was basically an oval hamper that was effectively had virtually everything you could ever want in it to make a kitchen, basically, and carried all the tea and sugar and everything else in it. But the first thing that happened was, as I'm sure many of you have read, is that the cost of these horses was extortionate. Some people were lucky enough to get one for maybe 50 or 80 pounds. Some were paying up to 150 pounds for a mule. Now, you might think, well, what does 150 pounds mean? Well, I come across many people who say, I've spent my entire annual allowance from you, Dad, on this mule. You know, I hope you don't mind, but I might be asking for more money later because I've already spent everything. And apparently, I've done the comparisons, and apparently it's worth around about £7,000 in today's money. So it's not an inconsiderable amount of money for a mule. But, and you don't need to read all that, but that is just one officer listing, he's a hussar officer, what he's carrying on the back of that mule. The poor mule is carrying one hell of a lot of equipment. It's incredible what they were expected to take, and in fact what they thought they needed on campaign to be able to survive a campaign. This was deemed by him his minimum. He couldn't live without any of it. Now let's get into the march in itself. We know there are long marches in the peninsula, and there are some famous awful marches, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the long marches themselves, obviously they were in hot weather, they were in in terrible winds and rain, etc. But the average march a day, it does vary. The times of starting vary as well. You've got from 1 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock in the morning, till 7 o'clock in the morning, till 11 o'clock in the morning, till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. There's none of this, oh, we marched early to actually get out to avoid the sun constantly. They were, if you actually look at even the same diary of the same officer or soldier, they vary on a regular basis, I guess, depending on troop movements around them, etc. But and the length of the marches average 10 to 15 miles a day, with every 4 or 5 days having a day's break. A heavy march, 25, 30 miles. Obviously, some famous ones are a bit longer, but the majority of that sort of length was a heavy march. And I put the other comment on the bottom about the women, because clearly we know some women came across with the actual men. But one of the things that was quite clear was that pregnant women were not meant to actually go with the army. They were supposed to stay at Lisbon. And also anybody with children, because they didn't want the children going up with the army either. I'm not saying that's what happened. In fact, I can tell you it didn't happen, because they found other ways of getting there, but they weren't taken forward with the army officially. Let's put it that way. Now, the first thing I want to talk about marches is that early on in the war, there is the system of taking them by boat up to Santarém, up through the Tagus, which takes about 40-mile journey up the river, which then allowed them to march through Castelo Branco and across the border to join the army on the border somewhere. Now, in 1811 and into early 1812, that changed virtually permanently. And the reason for that is because the Navy was able to guarantee the safety of these trips up the coastline. And by dropping them off at Figueira de Foz, they could cross the country in a much shorter distance. And in fact, it took about the best part of 80 miles off the journey, which is the best part of a week's marching. So the troops were able to move forward much quicker. But one of the things I want to bring up is that, and I just looked for many of the accounts of the marches, the famous, or should we say infamous marches, the one to Corunna, obviously the one on the retreat from Talavera back to into Portugal. And when I say Salamanca, they're the third one, that's actually from the retreat in 1812 from Madrid and sort of Burgos. And all of them mention, none of them really mention particularly long marches. Most of them mention sometimes not great weather. But what they all mention very consistently is the lack of provisions. And when I then started looking through the records a bit further, I can find many marches of this length being done by units regularly throughout Spain. The only reason these three become infamous is purely the actual failure of the commissariat to feed the troops for various reasons in each case. But it's all about the actual food and provisions. The length of the marches, the weather they're in is no different to any other march they do. And it does highlight, I suppose, particularly why these marches get mentioned so much. But what I would say is that they are very rare. I mean, we know of 3 big ones. There are a few others that get mentioned as well. But overall, there are many long marches like this where the actual troops are well fed. And funny enough, there is no comment. There is only comment about, yes, we've marched 7 days on a trot and we've done X number of miles or whatever. But because clearly they're being fed, they don't even mention the fact of lack of food. And the marches aren't beyond them. So it's something that they actually are aware of. So it's only the food situation that seems to really make them different and make them awful. Okay, so how do the troops get sort of billeted, etc.? Well,
as far as everyone's concerned, I think most people, when you ask them what happened, officers get into lovely houses and sort of with the locals. The rankers sleep out in all weathers under the stars, and that finally tents were issued in 1813 and they were all in tents. Wrong. Tents were actually issued to officers right from very early on in the war. This quote is actually from 1810, when it says the field officers and officers of each company had a tent, and that they were able to take them from Lisbon as long as they were able to get them on their mule, effectively. They weren't given specific transport for it. So tents were available to officers from quite early on, but it is true that they actually did live in houses and accommodation where possibly. But clearly the quality of the actual places they stayed did vary dramatically. I mean, the one in green here mentions the fact it was actually rather superior to a pigsty, but not better than a stable. So you get some idea of what it's like. But clearly, any roof, if it had a roof and sort of dry walls, was actually preferable. And in fact, in wet weather is even preferable to a tent, because canvas, as you all know, will actually only stand so long before that gets wet. But it's to say, I mean, the general joke from the officers seems to be that, one night in a pigsty, the next night in a palace. And that seems to be their sort of take on things. But what about the men? Did they really sleep out all year round? Seeing the stars above their head and just maybe a blanket at most to cover them? Well, actually, there are many, many quotes in their sort of comments, etc., about the fact that they were in uninhabited houses, that they were given shelter even away from the sun, because it was actually accepted the fact that they needed to get out of the sun. But then when it gets into the more rainy seasons in the winter, it becomes clear that, in fact, that many of the soldiers are actually put into buildings on purpose. Because clearly, they were not idiots. They were not unaware that you leave soldiers out in the wet and the cold, you're going to get an awful lot of sick and dead soldiers. So they did do something about it. And in fact, although they didn't have tents at that time, they did do what they could to actually put them into accommodation wherever it was possible. And this, I think, is something that gets lost in some of the sort of stories later on. They get forgotten about. And one of the things I would say is the last comment is just an interesting one. It got to the point where some regiments, the weather was so wet that the soldiers were banned by order from the commander of the regiment from leaving the accommodation to ensure they didn't get wet and sick, which I think puts a different aspect perhaps on some of the things people think about how the soldier fared. But I also want to mention something else, because there are times in Spain and Portugal when they're not near habitable or even uninhabitable buildings where they could actually take shelter. So do they just lie out in the fields then? Well, it doesn't seem so, because in fact, they sometimes use the term bivouacked, but more often they use the word hutted. We were hutted. We were in comfortable huts. Now, they're not the huts that the French were building, not these sort of hutted towns that they marveled at when they captured them and sort of found that they literally had streets with names on it and everything else, and they were all brilliantly built, etc. It seems, to what I've read, that when they say they hutted, they actually built lean-tos. Now, this is a picture actually from Copenhagen. It's the only one I could find with a sort of an image that was similar to it, but they've clearly found some planking and they've actually put it up against a tree and formed some sort of formal sort of little sort of shelter. And it is quite clear that they were actually cutting down branches from trees and throwing furs or ferns over them to actually form some sort of shelter, both from the sun and also partly, at least, from the rain. So were they lying out in the fields most of the time?
it seems not, unless they were in a complete desert where there was no trees around to actually do any of this. Now, we know what they thought about Portuguese troops. I think we do anyway. And I'm not really going to say too much more that's different on that, because they started off thinking that they weren't really going to be of much use at all. And then actually equating them with British troops, which for British troops at that time who thought they were the world's best, that is saying something. They were actually being quite generous by saying so. The only time, funny enough, that seems to slip is that they seem to think the Portuguese troops are not very good in sieges. Now, it's not to say that anybody, and we'll talk about sieges later, but particularly the Portuguese seem to get a very bad press, even in the latter stages of the war, at sieges. And I'll be interested if you hear sometime from Bob Burnham. I know he's writing a book on this subject, or has written a book on this subject when it comes out, if his actually backs that up in any way. But there's a different attitude to the people. When they arrive and they start traveling around Portugal, many of the officers and men are actually, I mean, well, the first comment says it all, we're draining England's treasury and to the votes of millions, as he says, for the sacrifice of their friends and their sons in early graves for a race unworthy to be free. In fact, some of them even say, we should really let the French take over and let them sort them out for a couple of years, and then the Portuguese might actually be reasonable people. They're a nasty race. They're treacherous. They're cowardly. This is the sort of comments that they're thought about. Whether people have had bad experiences, people have things stolen or whatever from their lodgings, etc., I don't know. But there is a really bad atmosphere and a thought about what the average Portuguese person is like. However, that changes as they go up country and they see the devastation and what people are actually having to live under after the French have actually invaded. And you obviously get people found in hovels with, literally supping on acorns and some water or a tiny bit of goat's milk. And one thing I don't know if people have realized, that in fact, it got so bad that, in fact, the soldiers, as they were going back to the lines of Torres Vedras, saw the terrible condition that many of the Portuguese were in who had actually been forced out of their homes, etc. And they actually set up kitchens, food kitchens, basically with all ranks, giving subscriptions to it, and even the commissariat being encouraged to supply perhaps stuff that was not deemed good enough for the English troops, but it was good enough to feed them with something. And a number of them were set up, etc. Many of the actual refugees, in fact, actually set up camp in the hedges around the cantonments of the British regiments, etc., so they could be fed on a regular basis. So attitudes did change to the Portuguese. Now, to the Spanish, there was a very different situation. The British had arrived in sort of the Peninsula, having heard about the Spanish gallantry in fighting to Napoleon, etc., and how they've been sort of really sort of holding, in their words, should we say, holding Napoleon's army back, and in fact even defeating them, etc., if you believed all the reports. And because of that, they arrived and saw that the Spanish people were a very different people to the Portuguese, that they're more like us. They resemble us. Their frames and bodies and their undaunted minds are very British-like. That they're scrupulously honest. Some areas of Spain are beautifully clean, although I have to say that is not true of all areas. There are many areas in Spain that resemble Lisbon, as I've shown you partly earlier on. And they go on about the Spanish pride and everything else, and that they have a sort of pride that thinks that all other nations are inferior, which is just like us, really, and they actually recognize that in themselves. So the Spanish come out really well, despite the fact that there's all these losses, and there's times when they hate them, like in the Talavera campaign, and they actually don't supply them with the food, etc.
But they even get to the point of saying, and as the Spanish army improves in the war, there is this constant theme of that the Spanish soldier is a wonderful soldier. And in fact, the general comment seems to come out that it's actually that it's lions being led by donkeys, and that's how they see the Spanish army. And they actually admire the Spanish people and hate and detest the Spanish officer corps and nobility, etc., which is quite a different view of things as how they've looked at Spain, as I looked at Portugal. Now, I also just want to mention the King's German Legion one thing, only because the King's German Legion has a high reputation in Peninsula. There's certainly, very good comments about how they can cope with their fatigues. In fact, there's actually a comment that the Germans, particularly because they used to sing on the march, etc., would cope with marches better than the Brits, etc. But actually, the comments come out very clearly that the army and the actual artillery, sorry, the cavalry and the artillery are excellent, probably the best cavalry in the Peninsula. But the infantry from the KGL are regarded as very poor throughout the entire period. Now, camp life. Now, we all know that, sort of war, as they've said on many occasions, is 95% boredom and 5% sheer terror. Well, obviously, in the 95% boredom, it's like, what do you do with yourself? Well, clearly, one of the first things was to flirt with the local Spaniards. We'll talk about that a bit more later. And write home on a regular basis. Hence, we get so much writing. But they did do a lot of sport. Not so much mention of football, funny enough, but a lot of things like tennis, with racket courses being set up and that. Obviously, a lot of hunting. Lots of hounds out there. In fact, I mean, he's even mentioned about grand wolf hunt, which Wellington went to, etc. So that was quite a thing. A lot of sort of race days. You obviously use your mules for the race days. You didn't use even with the cavalry, they didn't use their charging, sort of their finest horses, because at the end of the day, you wanted them for battle and they're too valuable to waste. But, you get some good sport from all the mules having a race. And of course, you get the theatres, which are very famous. And of course, obviously, is famously the Light Division Theatre, for example. The only comment I want to make on that is that comment at the bottom there saying about the fact that there was 3 different plays he'd actually performed came from an officer of the 28th Foot, which are not in the Light Division, because it wasn't just the Light Division that did it. It's one of those little things that the Light Division seem to have sort of grabbed and sort of tried to make their own. But in fact, it's quite common for most divisions to have actually been doing all of these things, and theatricals was regular to all of them. Now, sickness, obviously, clearly there was a huge amount of sickness, whether it was through sort of the wear and tear of the traveling around and getting sores, etc. The injuries, the number of accounts I've come across where people have got broken ribs from a kick from a mule, etc. But clearly the big problems were things like the agues, as they call them, or fevers, and dysentery. And as you can see, if you look at number 2 and number 3 on here, I think the descriptions say enough for themselves as to exactly what they're talking about. Clearly, it was a regular problem, and one they actually sort of dealt with even writing home about it with a bit of jocularity. I'm sure they didn't until they felt better, should we said. But I think the main thing I would say about that is clearly there was a great attempt to actually look after the sick. Hospitals were set up. Mick Crumpling has written much on this, etc. I know he's on here. But one comment I would come up with is that, and I put this last comment in on purpose because it came up a number of times, is that the soldiers felt that the regimental hospitals run by their own surgeons were excellent. And in fact, this is a General Stopford going around a few, and he actually found them excellent when he went round. It's interesting to see that, in fact, in comparison, every soldier I can find writes that you don't want to go to a general hospital
because that's just to go to die. Yeah, you don't come back. So it's a very different attitude about those big general hospitals. Although Mick will show you that the proof of the pudding is that as the war went on, they got much better, and the treatment the troops got much better. But that's probably 1814. Most of these people are writing in 1809 to 1812. Certainly don't share those views. Now, punishment. Now, clearly, there was a number of what can we get? Let's just say it's not Wellington's sort of comment about the dregs of society being in the army or whatever, and just there for drink. But there were some terrible characters within the army, as there would be in any army. Murderers, as I said, murderers that had not been found out, for example, is one of the comments on here. Another mentions the fact that both the Portuguese and the Spanish are terrible, but we're actually worse. So there's actually an admittance that the Brits were even worse. And it was only the fact that the severe discipline was used that actually kept them under control. Now, we know that throughout, particularly Spain, but sometimes in Portugal, the locals thought it was barbaric that they were actually using the lash on people. And in fact, quite often you'd get local clerics trying to stop the punishment. Apparently, if a cleric walked into the square and actually threw down his cloak, it was accepted in Spain and Portugal that the punishment ended immediately. So the British, not wishing to offend them, used to hide, and they would find yards where the Spanish cleric couldn't find them, etc. So they couldn't hopefully sort of get to that point, so they could get on with continuing to actually deal with the lash. At the same time, however, I would say you do get an undercurrent of people also turning a blind eye to certain things. And certainly, I know Zach has been looking into things like this. Zach White, who's on here, maybe on here, no, I don't know, has been sort of looking into sort of things where regiments downgrade punishments. So they actually, a deserter suddenly becomes somebody that's absent without leave and, gets dealt with by the regiment instead of by a major court-martial. And there's also some blind eyes turned with things like plunder, for example. And an excellent one at the bottom there, you have the colonel of a regiment actually turning around to his quartermaster, who is obviously of a captain's standard in the regiment, basically having found a load of money at Vittoria, and as I was saying to the colonel, what do I do with this money? And he's told to basically shut up and hide it, basically. And I don't know anything about it. But the biggest thing I would say about punishment is, and this is where I come to moral stances later. If you read many of the memoirs after the wars, there is the moral stance of, it was terrible. It was appalling. It should never have happened. The problem is that's not said by the soldiers at the time. They actually believed that the strong punishment was the only way that many of these soldiers were kept from doing more terrible things than they did. And that's what I'm saying is the whole thing about that we shouldn't be using the lash on the troops, etc., is something that came out beyond the wars. It was a sort of something of the 1820s, etc., 1830s, this drive to end the use of the lash. And basically, many of those later memoirs pick up on that subject, and actually perhaps they've changed their minds themselves by then, but certainly, rightly or wrongly, that was not the views actually portrayed on the battlefield. Now, as to women, clearly, you've got an awful lot of young men away from home, away from wives, girlfriends, if they've got them, or anything else. And they're clearly going to actually fraternize with the local population. Dangerous game, because certainly there are certainly a number of murders and sort of stabbings, etc., referred to regarding effectively honor attacks, basically, where the male Spaniards took exception to their women showing any interest to the soldiers themselves. One thing that I find very
very interesting all the time is this, and I'd love to know where it comes from, but they all come out to Spain with this idea that the convents are filled with 20-year-old virgins just waiting to actually be enticed away from the convent and to run off with them into with the army. And you know, they're all constantly queuing up to go and see what the nuns are like, etc., in these convents. Invariably, they find them to be very older women, etc., and they're not overly complimentary about what their looks, etc. They occasionally find the odd one who they feel is very young and has just been taken in for a while. But there is, let's just say, there's a lot of disappointment, should we say, in their memoirs regarding it on letters. But it's not unknown as well. The ordinary soldier obviously didn't have a social problem with actually dealing with the women there and actually treating them as an equal. And in fact, many Spanish women actually either officially married or more often unofficially married a soldier and followed them for the rest of the war. But with officers, that couldn't be done. Clearly, you couldn't, unless they were a Spanish heiress. Basically, normally, you couldn't do anything like that. Yeah, everyone was probably shouting at me, Harry Smith and Juanita. It's an exceptional case. Most officers would not be even think of a Spanish woman as being an equal socially, and would not dream of even think about marrying them or getting into a serious relationship. That's not to say they didn't have relationships, but they were never serious. I've mentioned the last one on here. I've just put the last one on there for Lieutenant Newland. Now, he's Newland of Mercer's troop at Waterloo, funny enough. He's out there as a lieutenant, and apparently he's chosen a woman, it was clearly not his wife, to go around with him for the war. In fact, the only comment is, I'd have chosen a much more pretty one, apparently. Now, the French themselves, there is obviously a general thought that the French dealt with the Portuguese and the Spanish in a terrible way. They just devastated everywhere they went. Well, again, it's not what the Brits say. Yes, there are occasions where, when in, say, the invasion into Portugal, they say they burnt all their way down. They butchered everyone possible. But in other parts of the country, they come across them and you get people saying that we paint them as being terrible and in strong colors, etc., but we injure them far more. Because when the French do these heavy contributions, etc., they actually land on the wealthy classes, not on the peasant classes who can't pay anyway. And therefore, they actually are more fair, should we say. The other thing is that they actually admit that in many areas of Spain where there was no trouble, the French didn't destroy. They actually just settled in those parts of Spain and just required certain food numbers or certain amount of money or whatever, but left the inhabitants to get on with their lives. And in fact, there are many parts of Spain where, in fact, they got extremely well with the French and didn't actually particularly like it when the Allies turned up later. And in fact, British officers admit this and say that effectively, if you want to look at it in a similar style, I would actually describe it as the way the Germans almost did with Europe in the 1940s. That if an area didn't resist, they were relatively lightly policed. If they actually were guilty of, there were atrocities against French soldiers or anything else, attacks, etc., then, or any sort of resistance, you could guarantee that it would come down like a ton of bricks on people. And that is how they seem to deal with this. And in fact, the Brits recognized that, and they said that in fact, in many areas, they treated them much better than we did. Now in battle, I'll only mention this very quickly. Clearly, numbers of people obviously were in battle. And they, you obviously read in many of his memoirs, long stories about all that went on in the battle, etc. Well, clearly, in these letters and everything going home, they're all just talking about what they did, what they saw. And it is obviously very limited. In fact, most cases, it's just about what, either
what they saw afterwards, which was awful in the way of the devastation that was left after a battle, etc., or that they were safe, they hadn't been killed themselves, or they had some lucky breaks, like hitting on the sole of their shoe instead of hitting them, etc. So it was very personal sort of battles they discuss, not the grand strategies of what's going on, etc. They don't know that. Sieges, however, were seen as the worst possible thing. They were the most harassing and unpleasant duties in the British service, is what one man says here. And clearly they were awful. The scenes were terrible. They were dreadful in every sense, whether it was caused by the Brits after they broke in or even just the general scenes afterwards. I mean, the last comment is actually regarding San Sebastian many, many days after it was all over, and there were still carcasses on the streets everywhere and sort of everything left out everywhere you can imagine. Nothing had been cleaned up and sorted out. But it was very much clear that sieges was actually a dreadful business, and they didn't want to do them at all possible. Hence, I guess, if you want to be honest, most of the sieges in Spain and Portugal did not go brilliantly for the Brits. They did get through them, but more by sheer determination and bravery than anything else, not by art and guile, should we say. One little comment I would make, and it's another one that comes up, just a little like division myth I just want to bust if I can. We've got the scene at Badajoz where they every night at the end of their shift of actually doing the sort of their work in the siege trenches, etc., the light division march back to their quarters and they have to cross the rivulet. And of course, it's also stated that Crawford controlled them so strictly that they marched across, get fully wet, etc., didn't care, just marched off to their quarters, etc. Well, not according to any of the letters I can read. We took our shoes and socks off and crossed over. Well, doesn't it make perfect sense? You don't want your soldiers with trench foot from wet feet on a constant basis. So I'm afraid that little myth needs to be put to bed as well at some stage. Wounds, well, clearly, I mean, obviously I'm not going to go into the types of wounds, etc. We know all that, but really it's the fact that it was, they wanted to personally contact people at home quite quickly. And the reason for that is, first of all, if you're an officer, mostly this is for an officer, officers' names went straight into the return regarding killed and wounded from any battle. And therefore they went in the Gazette, it got published, the Gazette got therefore copied in all the local papers, and your family got to see, oh my goodness, Johnny's been shot. All right, we've heard nothing from Johnny. Has he survived? Well, so therefore Johnny, first thing he does as soon as he gets back to a tent, if he's capable of doing so, even with a wound in his leg or whatever, will write off a small note saying, yeah, I'm still alive and I think I'm okay. The doc says I should pull through, etc. All right. Or a good friend of his does so. And you get many letters from friends to the family to say, before the Gazette arrives, hopefully this will get to you to tell you that this is what's happened. And they've got a chance of getting it because they're probably going back in the same dispatch on the same packet. And obviously that has to go to London, be published, and then be published by the other papers. So if it goes straight to the families, they've got a good chance of getting it ahead of them. Obviously, you've also got those who get killed. And one thing that perhaps surprises me is they were much more used to death than us in those times. I mean, death was something they would live with all the time. And yet the outpouring of grief when somebody dies out there was huge. And I mean huge, probably much more than we would today. And again, there are letters going back straight away. Very good friends of people of anybody that was shot or killed was literally a letter was sent off immediately. The last thing you wanted was the family to learn of the death of their poor son in the Gazette. So they actually went straight off to, got a letter off in the post to try and do something about it. Or they sent it to somebody else to say, can you please tell the family, to their own family and say, please send them a letter, or go, if you're local, go and see them and actually please tell them, unfortunately, their son has died before it gets in the papers. So what about the ordinary soldiers? Now, we have got some. In fact, the last two on this page are both from rankers. And there are an increasing number of these I'm finding where people have written back to the UK to say to their wives or whatever, can you tell the wife of such and such that unfortunately her husband is wounded or he's dead? Because they weren't in the dispatches. They would never know possibly whatever happened to their people because they just didn't come home or whatever. So there is a more surprising sort of increase in this. But I did say that their grief was sometimes worse than ours. I have come across two accounts at least so far now where people have actually suggested, well, one did and the other suggested but didn't do it. In the end was persuaded not to actually dig up the body of his brother to actually see him again before a last time because he'd been buried so quickly that they hadn't actually physically seen him. So their grief was that raw that things like that were possible. Now, just to come back to that letter, because we're finishing up now, that letter was written by General Crawford, who was the very strict leader of the actual Light Brigade, and many of his officers actually hated his guts with a passion. I can promise you that if you read the letters of him. Perhaps a side of him that perhaps you wouldn't have expected, his letter to his son earlier. Now, I've only been able to touch at things. That's literally a very brief overview of what I've actually discovered, but there's masses more. This book will come out in the summer sometime. I haven't been given an exact date yet. It'll come out this summer, and it obviously will hopefully deal with a great deal more than this one does here. I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I will just leave it at that and come out of sharing the screen so then John can take back over, I presume.
Yeah, that was very wonderful.
I'll put the lights on a second.
Fantastic. That was very wonderful. I can only echo what Brian Southwell has said on behalf of everybody. That was another superb talk and very, very revealing. Dare one ask, are we about to see Peninsular Archive Volume 1 in addition to that book?
Well, actually, there's a couple of things that's going on. I had to do a lot of work for Bob Burnham on his Light Division. So I've actually got in the next year or so, depending on how Pen and Sword can get them out, there won't be a set, but it'll be 3 different volumes of the 3 different regiments of the Light Division who have never been published before. So I've got a book on the 43rd coming out first, then there'll be a 52nd one, there'll be a 95th one of people who've never been published. So a lot of Light Division stuff there. I'm also doing, I was going to call it the Peninsular War Archive through Ken Trotman, but we've actually decided to call it the Napoleonic War Archive. It won't cover Waterloo, but many of the accounts cover other campaigns just before the Peninsula, and I don't want to cut them out because it's terrible to actually sort of cut out Copenhagen or if they go to America afterwards. So there is a new series about to start shortly.
Brilliant. Now, I will ask Evelyn to close, but what I'm going to do is try and whiz through as many of these questions as I can. Now, we're flooding in at the moment.
Oh, okay.
So I'm afraid, people, I'm going to have to be very selective on what I ask, but I pass on. One question we got very early on in your talk: did many of the British soldiers retire to Portugal or Spain after the fighting? Was this the start of a British port families? I can answer the port families question, but did many retire to Portugal or Spain after the fighting?
There are not many records of many going back. There are a few, but most of the soldiers that went back probably just disappeared into the system. We just don't know. But there is talk of them going back, but not so many that go back physically. Although many go back with the British Brigade, of course, in 1823 when there's fighting, etc. So they get involved in that, and then they, of course, go off to South America. So some of them do, but unfortunately, it's quite hard to prove how many, but certainly many were not happy with leaving what they believed as were their wives in Bordeaux at the end in 1814. And some of them undoubtedly found their way back.
Great, thank you. And as regards to port, no. Taylor's is founded 1670. Sorry, Wars is founded 1670. Taylor's 1695. A lot to do with the marriage of Catherine Braganza of Portugal to Charles II. So, in fact, the War family are actually used to not only to serve in the Peninsula, but to head up some of the spy operations, I understand as well.
Yeah.
Next question I've been asked. Were there instances of troops being sailed inland in rivers rather than just marching?
Occasionally, yes. Certainly, I can think about in the campaign up to Oporto, they were actually taking on the salt barges through the marshes there. Wellington tried to actually get round the back of the French, but they realised and retreated up to Oporto before they could get trapped. Other than that, limited. Mostly, I mean, they largely kept away from water and just crossed it as fast as possible.
Fully understand. I have got a question from Rob Burnham, and it's not about sieges, I hasten to add. How much did it cost to send a letter back to the UK from Portugal and Spain? He draws a parallel with the modern American military, where there's no actual rate of postage charged.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it wasn't free, but unfortunately, it's actually the receiver that paid. So when they came to the army, they didn't pay for the ones they received, but they actually, when they sent them home, the people at home had to pay for them on the doorstep when they got them. The postman would actually ask for his 4 pence or whatever. To be honest, the rates are not that clear. I mean, I haven't looked into in great detail, but that's the bit that's a bit strange is to most people is it's the receiver, not the sender, that pays.
Right, I've been asked a question by Jaskirat here. There's a number of questions, but I'm going to dive into this one. Can you tell more about the murders and stabbings which you mentioned earlier? So these are the affairs of honour, etc.
Yeah. Well, they happen throughout the period. I mean, when the troops at any stage are actually in a village for any length of period, you get fraternizations with the locals. You then get some locals getting upset because perhaps that's the woman that they've eyed up, and now some hussar officer has got in the way. And you do come across a number of them. There's a number of them in 1813, funny enough, for the SARS, where I can think of soldiers literally being found with their throats cut and with the socks shoved in their mouths to keep them silent as they cut their throats or whatever. There's certainly an officer I can think, his name has gone on my head now. I think it's Gordon actually, but I can't remember 100%. Gets shot through a door when they're trying to get in, basically, because he's been with a woman. He's got the woman in the room. And I mean, you get lots and lots of incidents of this. I mean, if you actually go through them, there are numerous of them. Basically, going out with a woman in Spain was a very dangerous game, basically.
Be warned, good people, when foreign travel resumes. Absolutely. I've been asked a question. You know, you showed the thing on punishment, and it looks like a cat o' nine tails. And I've been asked a question: was that used just in the Navy, or was it used in the Army as well?
Well, they used effectively the same thing. I mean, they were, there were slight variations to them, but there was hardly anything. I mean, they were virtually using the same thing, and they would get the drummers to use it basically in rotations, usually doing only a few strokes each, so they made sure that it was kept going basically.
Right. Mick has asked a question. Mick Crumpley, what do we know about mental health issues during the Peninsular War?
It's a very good question, and it's one I have to be honest. I can say limited availability of information on it because, you know, for all of these letters and journals, I guess it's something you don't actually accept, you know, you don't talk about too much. The only thing I can say is there are a lot of people who actually have what I can only describe as very unusual illnesses where they seem to be paralyzed, or they believe themselves to be paralyzed for long periods, etc., and then they get better and etc. And I don't know whether it's manifestations of people just not being right. Do you know what I mean? The black dog is with them or whatever. I don't know. But you obviously don't get that terminology. There's no understanding of that. There's just this general feeling that I get from some of them that some of the memoirs I put out, people say, my God, he was a real hypochondriac. He was constantly ill with something. And you're thinking, well, is that a manifestation and that type of thing? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess not everybody did an Erskine and flung themselves out of a window.
No, exactly.
I've been, okay. That's, I think, a comment. Let me move back. Did you come across, this is from Tanya in Canada, did you come across any comments by soldiers who fought through Portugal and Spain, then found themselves being sent to British North America or off the coast of America for another campaign?
Well, yeah, certainly a number of them did particularly in 1814, when the war finished in Europe, at least for a year. Many of the regiments got sent directly to America. And so obviously the whole idea was that a lot of new, very experienced regiments would turn the tide in the British favor quite quickly. It's not exactly how it panned out, with a number of incidents where that didn't work at all, but certainly many troops did go without even seeing Britain straight to America.
Tanya, two, for example, De Lacy Evans, who serves under Sir William in the 3rd Dragoons, goes over to America to the War of 1812, and I think he's one of the few people, Gareth, that's got the Naval General Service Medal, as well as the Military General Service Medal. And Tanya, there's somebody that ends up in your neck of the woods, Braithwaite Christie, who is Sir William Ponsonby's ADC. After the War of 1815, he gets a posting in Canada. So I think I may be on the final one here. This is a comment from Ian. Comment to Gareth. This is Rob. Comment to Gareth about Portuguese during sieges. They played a small role in Ciudad Rodrigo, Mort Badajoz, but a significant role at San Sebastian.
Yeah, I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying that the British troops thought they were excellent troops, but the only time they ever criticized them, even when they thought they were excellent troops, was particularly at San Sebastian. They get a really bad press.
Brilliant. I'm going to close it there, good people. I think it's been wonderful, but I'm going to ask the chairman to close. Evelyn, sir, over to you.
Gareth, as ever, thank you very much. Well, Harry Smith was lucky, wasn't he, in that case, in regards to the Spanish women. Well, I've got one question. That is that you made the comment that about the treatment of the either Portuguese or Spanish by British soldiers. I always understood that if they took provisions, they always paid for them, unlike the French.
Well, they gave them promissory notes. Well, they gave them promissory notes, which to a farmer who has to feed his family and he has all his crops taken away, a bit of paper which he has to go to Lisbon to get the money back, is not worth what it's written on. And it's the ordinary. What I was trying to say is that's the ordinary farmer who is just slaving to actually sort of get his own family fed, who is having to pay that. It's when they did these big contributions to the French, they were actually aiming it at the wealthiest in the cities. Yeah, they weren't asking the poor little farmer to give over his crops. They were actually demanding sort of monies from the top, basically. Or at least that was a theory of what they tried to do. I'm not saying it happened all the time. There were certainly times in Portugal where they were just as bad as the Brits, and many times worse.
You make a good point. I understand. I love the section you did on mail, because for a soldier serving overseas, mail was extremely important, and of course it did take a long time. I was reading Hugh Pike's book on the Falklands, and his accounts back to his wife are fascinating, and it was the only medium in which he could really sort of write down what he was feeling and how it was going as a commanding officer in the Falklands. So, even in quite recent times, these things were valuable. Since internet and everything else, of course, it's given me much more difficult to retrieve people's views and feelings on campaigns, because it's all done on, on the net, on the web.
Yes.
Anyway, Gareth, thank you very much indeed yet again for another fascinating talk and another book. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got 8 books of yours. How many have you actually written?
I'm on 95.
95?
Yes.
Well, I'm never going to get 95, I'm afraid. I just isn't room. Anyway, Gareth, thank you very much on behalf of everybody. And you've managed to keep 69 people going. So well done. Many congratulations. And thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to listening to you again one day.
Thank you
very much indeed.
Thank you.